Witamy Państwa bardzo serdecznie. Wspólnie z Duszko chcielibyśmy podziękować przede wszystkim organizatorom, czyli dyrekcji Zamku Ujazdowskiego, która zaprosiła nas, żebyśmy opowiedzieli o tej książce. Tutaj jest jeden egzemplarz na żywo. Wiemy, że niebawem, za dosłownie kilka dni książka dojedzie do księgarni i będziecie mogli wszyscy ją kupić w Warszawie. Bohaterką oczywiście jest ta publikacja, ale opowie o niej jej wydawca, inicjator i autor Duszko Petrovich, artysta wizualny, redaktor bardzo wielu przedsięwzięć wydawniczych i publicystycznych w Stanach Zjednoczonych, wykładowca wielu uczelni, a w tym momencie kierownik New Arts Journalism w Wyższej Szkole Instytutu Sztuki w Chicago. Także współtwórca samego wydawnictwa, które zatytułowane jest Paper Monuments i on o nim za chwilę nam więcej opowie. Autor tekstów krytycznych, recenzji publikowanych w Book Forum, w magazynie Slate, Globe, Art News, a także jednego z moich ulubionych czasopism i przedsięwzięć, które założył w 2015 roku, Adjunct Commuter Weekly, czyli tygodnika dedykowanego tym wykładowcom uniwersyteckim, którzy w Stanach Zjednoczonych dojeżdżają kilkukrotnie w przeciągu tygodnia do pracy różnymi środkami lokomocji i w tychże środkach mogą sobie czytać o różnych problemach, między innymi gentryfikacji i prekariacie, którego są poniekąd również częścią. Tak jak usłyszeliśmy, spotkanie odbywa się w ramach większej serii, która poddaje pod krytyczny namysł kształt instytucji publicznej w globalnym obiegu. Do tej pory gośćmi byli najczęściej dyrektorzy, kuratorzy bardzo dużych instytucji. Dzisiaj to nie będzie tylko jeden głos dotyczący instytucji i ważnego politycznego, społecznego momentu, w którym jesteśmy, ale to będzie ponad 30 głosów, które znajdziemy w tej publikacji. I w tym miejscu również bardzo serdecznie w naszym wspólnym imieniu dziękuję dwóm osobom, pani Agnieszce Tiutiuniuk i pani Annie Kobierskiej za organizację spotkania i promocję. Naprawdę współpraca z Zamkiem była wspaniała. I co? I możemy zaczynać już w języku angielskim, right? Shall we start? Okay. So when Dushko in fact gave me the book, it was last, I think, October, and we had been in Zagreb together. And the book seems to me to be very innocent enough, 100 pages, beautifully designed, and has also beautiful paper. So someone who is sensitive to the design aspects of the publication, it will be really attached to it, but I put it on the shelf in my library and didn't really look inside it. I didn't read any text. Few weeks after, when I was supposed to travel somewhere, I was thinking, okay, the size really fits to the traveling book and have it for a train, a 2-hour train to other city, and I took it with me. And I have to tell you, the innocence, the idea of the innocence immediately disappeared, and I discovered the look, the design. There are no images inside, there are pure text. It's absolute camouflage, or very strong content, very sensitive emotional statements of 30 invited authors who are curators, cultural producers, directors of big institution, mediums institution in the whole United States. And it's also a kind of a report, and we are going to speak about it, of its function as a report and seismograph of the very important moment of political and social changes that happen in America in the artistic world, but also the changes that somehow we can relate to our reality of nowadays, to the installation of educational system, to the growing neo-fascism, to growing fear in a society, intolerance, antagonism, and polarization of a language, of a public debates. So, Dushko, can you start with the idea that is behind the book, the Paper Monuments, who is the publisher, but also can you tell us something about the other editor, Roger White, with whom you made it,
Sure.
And about the title.
Oh yeah. Thanks everyone for coming. Thanks to Magda for inviting me to this talk. Is this working? Okay. And thanks to Zamek for hosting us. It's great to be here. I'm going to start just maybe by introducing you a little bit to Paper Monument generally, very quickly, so you understand where this one came into it, and then, what did you say, also my other collaborators and the title. So I think Paper Monument was started in 2007. I'm not totally sure what year it was, but it's about that. I stopped remembering after 10 years. With Roger White, who is another artist, editor, writer, critic, who I've been friends with for a long time. And it's actually mainly just us, but there's also Prem Krishnamurthy, who's the designer, and is now known as a curator as well, is a kind of associate editor. So that's what Paper Monument is. I'm just going to talk a little bit about our books really quickly so you understand where this comes from. The first one we did was, could you go back to the first one? Yeah, was I Like Your Work, Art and Etiquette from 2009, so that's 10 years ago. And we decided to, one of the ideas of Paper Monument is to take something that we hear people talking about, but we haven't seen in print, and to move it into print. That's kind of the basic idea. And the first one that we started with was this problem of etiquette and manners in the art world, because as you all probably know, there are rules, but they're different from the regular world rules, and sometimes it's embarrassing and painful if you don't follow them and things like this. But we like this because it was a very small, seemingly innocent way of talking about power and basically talking about power. So that was the first book we did, which was about etiquette, and it ended up being very popular. Everybody calls it a bathroom book because you can read it and everyone's like, oh, I saw that in my friend's bathroom. It's such a good book. But we're very proud of being a bathroom book because bathroom books you actually read, unlike a lot of books, right? So that's one of our philosophies. Okay, could we have the second slide? So the second one we did was, again, trying to take a seemingly small thing and see how it projects bigger. So the second book we did was about art assignments, and we wanted to do kind of a book about pedagogy in the arts generally and kind of a history, so we decided to look at the assignment, which I think in art school more than like medical school or science school or something, the assignment is like the main unit of teaching. You know, when they tell you like, make a drawing only using your feet, or I don't know, make a building only with cotton or something, right? They give you some problem. So we decided to do an anthology just looking at assignments and this kind of oral tradition. Again, taking something that's spoken and then transferring it over to print. So that was our second book, 2012. And could I have the next slide? And then we did a slightly different book for us because this was a book of texts that had already been published in other places. But we had the feeling, this was about 4 years ago, 5 years ago, that we were really living in an amazing time of artists' writings. And artists, because of the internet and because of independent publishing, had been able to express themselves in writing in a way that was unprecedented. And we were surprised, actually, that nobody had collected them. So this was our anthology. It's 15 years of sort of, you know, internet, digital writing, sort of new millennium writing. So that's a huge book. I think it's like 600 pages or something. It was a very big project. So anyways, that's just to give you a little bit of an overview. We do a book maybe like once every year or 2 years or something like that. So then if I could have the next slide, that brings us up to more or less the present, which was, for us, I think for most Americans, the 2016 election was a shock, and the result, I should say, was a shock. And at that point, almost really in the days after it happened, our first thought was, well, what can we do as publishers to respond, you know? And Paper Monument is an intentionally kind of paradoxical name because we're very slow, and we try to, as you can tell, we do a book once every year, once every 2 years. A lot of people, they always ask me, like, are we dead? Have we stopped? You know, like, is everything okay? Because we take a long time. And what we noticed, there was a first wave of projects that were like responding immediately, and you know, that's fine, but we wanted to kind of take a moment to think about what would be the best kind of angle, right, to respond to the situation. And we waited and waited and kind of looked for this kind of inspiration. And the thing that really caught our attention was not actually how we're artists and we mainly talk to other artists. It wasn't how other artists were talking, and it wasn't how other activists were talking, but we noticed that there was a big shift in how directors and leaders of bigger organizations were talking. So like people that are like slightly more powerful, slightly more conservative than us, and slightly older, I think. And what we noticed was that when the election happened, those people changed the most in the way they talked and the way they presented themselves. Because suddenly they stopped being kind of neutral people who had power, who didn't talk about politics. Maybe they talked about it in private, but you know, publicly they didn't talk about it. Suddenly they started writing emails like, we're gonna protect immigrants, or we just want to say that the LGBT community is important to us, or whatever. You know, these kind of very overt things. Some of them were kind of clumsy and weird because these people were not used to this kind of language, right? They were not activists. And so we started to think the next book should be about how institutional level thinking is responding to the new politics, based on these emails and these kind of public announcements. And the title and the way we thought about it. I mean, yeah, so the way we work is we generally try to think of questions with we work with questionnaires. So we send out the questionnaire, we try to send it out to a variety of people. So as Magda was saying, this book has like very famous people, very powerful people, and then medium people, and then, you know, younger people who are just starting and everything like that. We like to hear from kind of everybody, and this book in particular is very American, so we decided, even though it's a global phenomenon, obviously, it would be beneficial for everyone to have a book that focused on the US, so people could compare, as we probably will tonight, a little bit. So we came up with these questions that were kind of general, but also related to specific events that had happened in the US. So before we go into it, I'll just have the next few slides so you can see the questions that everyone got. In light of recent political shifts across the globe, have you sensed a change in the position of the art institution vis-a-vis political activism, right? Because that's what we noticed, was like there was a shift. And Magda and I were talking about it earlier. I think everybody in culture in the US moved to the left a little bit. But the most noticeable people were the kind of leaders and museum directors and these kind of people moved most to the left. So that was the first question. Everybody in the book, I think said yes to this question. They then gave different examples and different analysis, but everybody said, yes, there has been a shift. Okay, can I have the next slide? And then the second question is, can an art institution go from being an object of critique to a site for organizing? So this was, I think, kind of our thesis about what was happening was we lived through decades of institutional critique. We were all used to this kind of rhetoric, these kinds of projects. But now what we were seeing was sites for organizing, right? Like people were hosting events to help people protect immigrants, or hosting a kind of more organizing events, not just self-critique or whatever, but some kind of like political organizing. So we wanted to talk about how that was happening. And then the second question was maybe kind of stepping back, like, should the art institution play this kind of role? You know, I think there's a variety of opinions about that. And then what other roles might it play, right? So some people, I think, will want to say, no, we shouldn't be directly political, but maybe we should have a bar on Fridays where people can come and talk about politics. I don't know. Then the third question we asked was, we wanted to sort of generate and stimulate, as hopefully we'll have tonight, like a kind of broader conversation, right? Because we knew, again, we knew that people in private were talking about these problems and calling each other up and everything like that, but to generate kind of a bigger conversation, we wanted to know what other institutions, curators, or publics do you look to in formulating your own institution's position, which was to give a lot of these people who generally don't appear in public very much, right? Like, part of these people's job is to be withdrawn, private, and everything like that, to allow them to talk, okay, I really admire this institution, I follow what they do, I think it's very good, and to kind of generate this kind of dialogue about influence. This is getting hard for my neck. This is maybe the most American of the questions. We said, recent controversies over curatorial choices have foregrounded the different ways in which institutions envision their audiences. So that's actually a very polite way of saying there were some big fuck-ups recently, curatorially, that everybody knows about that we don't need to name. So can you talk about that? And then the second one was, in your experience, is this process changing? How should it proceed? Okay, so the first, the obvious examples are the Dana Schutz painting of Emmett Till that was in the Whitney Biennial, and the second example was Sam Durant's piece at the Walker Center, where he made a scaffold about Native American genocide without talking to any Native Americans. So those were the two kind of examples that everyone was talking about. And of course, everyone was talking about it in this horrible, messy Facebook argument, crazy way. So we asked the question, is this process changing and how should it proceed? Like, basically, there has to be a better way of digesting these mistakes when they happen. Second to last question, we're almost done. How can an institution address the dichotomy between art as a cultural entertainment and art as political inquiry? What is the role of the curator in mediating this? How does this compare to the artist's role? This was actually the question that most people did not like. Almost everybody was like, no, it's not a real dichotomy. It's not a problem. Don't ask me that, blah, blah, blah. So anyways, and then next slide. The last thing was this just kind of like, you know, how can institutions be better, which, you know, it's open. It gives them a chance to talk about something that we didn't ask, but it also was a chance for people to say, you know, A, B, and C are the important changes that need to be made, which I think is actually a hard thing for people who are working those jobs to say, right? Because you're working a job at an institution, and to say publicly what they should do better is a way of saying what the problems are, right? So one little note I'll just add about the book, and it's in our introduction, is that a lot of people could not write for this book, right? They wrote us back and they said, I can't, I'd love to, but I can't because I'll get fired, or I need my next job, or I don't like my boss, but I can't say that, right? And then a lot of other people had to talk to the legal department, had to talk to their boss, and you could tell that everything was kind of, you know, very carefully done. But we thought it was more important to try to at least try, right? So this was the kind of question of like, how can it be better? So Magda asked about the title. It comes from Alhina Katzhoff. I may be mispronouncing her name, actually. Her response to what other roles can or should it play. She had a huge list, maybe 30 choices that started with as radical, as mother, as salad, as shelter. And we thought that those 4 were kind of poetic, suggested different directions that institutions could take, and just generally made a good title for the book.
So you mentioned that all of the answers more or less came around May and June 2018. And you look at them and then edit them and put in a book. But if you can make now a picture, the general one first, what was the diagnosis that came out from the observations that stopped to be private and became public after being published? The network also changed into more official one. So what is the diagnosis sensed by this tool of that moment? Which is
it's interesting because we're already in the next moment. But you know, I think probably not a surprise to you. I mean, I think in 2016, when the election happened, the main response, I think, was shock, anger, and fear, basically. I think almost everybody had this kind of response. And then when they're writing for us, we're already talking about 2 years later. And I think the main thing that people were processing over those 2 years in different ways was that, you know, the election was a kind of, I mean, it was a huge problem. It remains a huge problem to have the current occupant of the White House. But that was a kind of superficial problem that was related to all these much deeper problems. And as soon as you start looking at the deeper problems, it becomes harder for an arts organization to separate itself from the political problems, obviously. So I think in 2018, people were more willing to talk about, for example, and this is, I think, a big difference between the US and Poland. You know, American arts institutions are basically private. You know, they have a little bit of public funding. I don't know what the numbers are. It's maybe like 10% or 7% or something like this. Nothing, but very small. And so the main players, I guess, in American arts funding are the rich. So they're all on the boards of directors. And I think it's fair to say that basically those people and what they do had previously been ignored, more or less, you know? Nobody knew who was on the Met board or who's on MoMA's board. I mean, maybe if you worked there, then you would know. But, you know, everyone in culture just kind of, you know, ignored who that was. But in the last few years, it's become more difficult to ignore who those people are, right? So for those of us who've been kind of political for longer, that's maybe one benefit of the current situation, is that you can talk, you know. So, and there are very direct lines between Trump and those people, right? So Mnuchin, who's the Treasury Secretary, his whole family is involved in the arts, and the Kushners collect art and everything. So I think in 2018, everyone started to talk about who's on the board, who's on the staff, and everything like this. And it became very hard to complain about Trump and his, for example, cabinet, if your cabinet looked the same, right? Like if your cabinet was also rich white men and your director was also a rich white man and conservative, then you sort of see like, oh, okay, there's Trump and the Met, and you know, where's the difference, right? So this was a kind of opening to be like, okay, let's talk about how these organizations are run, who they're run for. And it's obviously, it's a long conversation. It's not like it started in 2016, but it was definitely a pressure point in 2016. So when this book came out, I think a lot of these institutional people had kind of realized that they needed to confront these problems, make changes, and everything like that. But, and this is where we get into the difference between when the book came out and now, there still weren't a lot of big changes happening. You know, like the board of directors was the same, you know, nothing big changed. Recently, in the last Whitney Biennial, you have started to see change. So this is like one very, I mean, it's just one case study, but it's an important one. There's this guy Canders who's on the Whitney board who runs this company called Safariland. I'm sure many of the board members of all these organizations, all these museums run terrible companies, I'm sure. But Safariland was terrible in a very specific way, which was that they were making the tear gas that the US was shooting at asylum seekers when they were coming to the border. So they were coming to the border, which is legal, which is expected, which has been going on forever, and which normally is greeted with a kind of painful bureaucratic process, right? It's not like it's nice, but it's like, okay, now you're gonna wait for a year or 2 years and you come in. But instead, Trump and the immigration people started just shooting tear gas at people, right? Like children, old people, sick, and they're getting tear gas. So suddenly it becomes a question, who makes this tear gas? Oh, Safariland makes this tear gas, and the guy who runs that company is on the board of the Whitney. So a few interesting things happened. One is that there started to be public protests at the Whitney, which was a new thing and a good development in my view. The second thing, which I think is maybe the most important, was that the staff of the Whitney, the people who work at the Whitney, wrote a letter together saying, we do not accept this man being on our board of directors, he should be removed. So that's also a huge change, because normally, again, the culture of working in a museum in the US is not to write public letters about who's on the board or get involved in those questions, right? Because you could lose your job, and that's terrible. So they wrote that letter, and Adam Weinberg, who's the director of the Whitney, responded basically very condescendingly and said, I'm really glad you have that opinion, but you don't make those decisions. You're just the staff. Go back to work. So that was an interesting moment. And then the next thing that happened was when the Whitney Biennial was announced, it was announced that actually our friend, Michael Rakowitz, refused to participate. So Michael pulled out of the show before the show started and said, you know, that's where I draw the line. I'm not going to be in the show. So that was good, but it was one out of, I don't know what, you know, 80 artists. And everyone sat and waited for something else to happen. And then a few days ago, maybe 5 days ago, there was a really good essay published in Art Forum called The Tear Gas Biennial, which was written by Toby Haslett, Hannah Black, and I forget the third author. But it basically said, we should expect artists to take political positions, and even if it's going to hurt your career, that's why they call it a strike. Like that's why it matters, is you take a personal risk to draw a line. So actually a few days after that essay came out in Art Forum, I think 8 more artists dropped out. I forget if it's 7 or 8, it's something like that. And now we're waiting to see, the art needs to be taken off of the walls, which will be very interesting. And now the biennial will have areas, hopefully growing areas, that will just be blank. So this might not sound like that big of a thing, but it's, you know, it's the biggest recurring show in the US, and it's never happened before that artists started pulling their work out, you know. I kind of hope that everyone pulls it all out and they shut the whole thing down. It would be amazing. But at least, you know, we have 10% of artists saying no. And it now creates a problem because Adam Weinberg, you know, he could say one thing to his staff. He could say, go back to work or whatever. But now if you have the artists and the staff, you know, people start to see that there are options, right, politically, maybe, to press back and, you know, change the board of directors or something like that. Anyways, maybe that was a long story, but this is like kind of the briefest way to update you on what's a very like complex national, international situation, yeah.
If we would expect from the artist to take a radical political position, and then if we would expect from the art institutions to do the same, so to act, to share voice, or to give voice to, for instance, vulnerable communities, etc., etc., what would it mean to the American institutions on a very different models and levels to make a political decision, to work within the system of subsidies and financing, how you would describe it, what they can do to make political decision and act against the atmosphere, against the decisions made on federal or governmental level?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think if you were going to map like what institutions do, I think right now a lot of them are doing sort of small symbolic things, you know, for communities, like we're having a show that has these artists in it, or we're making this statement, this small statement. I think the next step, and a lot of the people said this in the book, the next step is to have more structural changes, right? Like who works at your museum, who is in leadership position as your museum, where does the money go in your museum, right? These are kind of the next level is not to like give, for example, a black artist a show, but to have someone, a black curator on staff is a more sustained commitment, right? And to go even further would be to have a director, and to go even further would be board of director level. And we were talking about this earlier. That's where you start to see the fights happen, you know? The situation is not so clear, for example, that, you know, like someone puts up an exhibition and someone else says, no, you can't do that, you're fired. Like that never happens, right? But there are more subtle little battles that happen within these different groups. And I think basically one of the things that can happen after a long time is like, let's just say you're showing work by all these marginalized groups, people of color, women, LGBTQ. Eventually that becomes boring to the people who are on the board of directors. Eventually, you know, they might like it once or once a year, or like for Christmas, or, you know, like some special little thing. But if you do it all the time, eventually that's not the art that they want in their palace, right? And then if you change your staff completely to that too, it's not going to go that well. You know what I mean? Like these boards of directors do not want to be having conversations every day about the direction feminism should take or something like this. This would be very irritating to those people to have their organization be doing that all the time. So it's like if the organizations slowly make those changes, there will start to be conflicts. And we started to see, again, just to give you like a couple of like data points, there were conflicts like Laura Reikovich at Queens Museum, Helen Molesworth in LA, Kimberly Myers also in California at Long Beach. These are situations where there's a conflict between a curator or a director and the board, and then they were fired, okay? I think that'll happen more and more, but it's not, again, in the US it's a more complicated thing because the money isn't as direct and the hiring and firing isn't as kind of centralized, right? So you could have a really nice board, like, I don't know, you know, some museum, I think ICA in Los Angeles, they have a really good board. They have progressive board, like they're going to be able to do good things. They have a nice board, you know. So their situation is not the same as LACMA or whatever. So, but the question that does come up is if you do stuff that's not interesting to rich people for long enough, you will not get rich people's money, right? And that's where the problem comes in. So I mean, me personally, I think that we need to fund the arts differently. I'm much more interested in not like 7 rich people giving all the money and then we all like play with their money. I would rather have a situation where everyone has more money and the rich have less money, but okay. And then we each give money to institutions that matter to us, and then they provide things to us that matter to us, right? So in the book, there were a few examples like that. One of my favorites was Dina Beard from the lab in San Francisco, and Dina recently started a thing where the lab was going to buy their own building. So they crowdsourced a thing for the lab. It's like an experimental music site, right? So also very boring to rich people, like generally not interested in experimental music. So the lab went to its audience and said, like, if this is important to you, you want to keep coming to our concerts, help us buy our building, because we can't survive in San Francisco unless we buy the property, because the rent is just going up and up. So they led a really nice campaign to buy their building. Anyways, it's not perfect, it's still capitalism, et cetera, but I like that model of like building a community, building an audience, knowing who the audience is, the audience invests, you're responsible to them, and you develop that kind of relationship. I don't know. Yeah.
You mentioned at the beginning that there was a lot of a fear when Trump won the election and became a president, and the fear grew up with the time.
Yeah.
In fact, nowadays in Poland, after what happened just a few days ago, so there is a growing fear about what happened in Białystok on the parade,
yeah.
but
yeah.
also 2 days ago when you open a Facebook and you saw the huge red flag with swastika hanging in the National Museum in Warsaw, and then finally you figure out it was just a film setup, you also felt a huge fear. But if the institutions were so highly dependent on the private money and subsidies, which is so different to Polish situation when we are directly in the majority funded by the Ministry of Culture, and the institution depend from annual grants, which can be cut, but they can also be redirected, etc., etc. So what they had been afraid of, the directors of the institutions in states?
Yeah, I mean, so this is a good question, because I don't think that people were genuine. People were not afraid of what like Trump would do to the arts directly. I don't think, because in fact the federal government doesn't have that much power directly related to the arts. You know, of course people don't want him to destroy the National Endowment for the Arts. It's a serious thing. It would be a disaster if he did, but I don't think that that was what people were afraid of. People were afraid of much more basic things, like what is happening. You know, like people are being rounded up and put into cages. People are not, you know, there's just chaos in terms of how the immigration system is being run. Police are getting to be more and more violent. There's no consequences for that. So I think part of what made us make the book, and part of what was interesting, was I don't actually think that the museum directors and everyone were worried about their jobs in a direct way, like which is different than here. Here, I think that's actually very, very serious. But in the US, I think most of those people were still safe, basically, but they started to see really quickly that other people were not safe. So very quickly we saw, like, for example, at the school where I teach this, at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, the question was, would we provide documentation to the federal government about all of our students? Because if we did, they could come in and start deporting people, you know? So this was a very big question for the school. You know, I guess maybe someone would maybe lose their job if they refused to give that documentation. But it was really not about art at that point. It was really about how do we function as an organization when the organization above us is so violent, right? I mean, I think that's a lot of what these people were dealing with. What we've seen is that I think there is some amount of protection in the courts, you know, through elections and everything like that, against the worst things that Trump has proposed. But we've also seen that many of the horrible things that he wants to have happen are happening. You know, we have thousands and thousands of people in cages, children are dying, and so this is obviously a nightmare. But I think people still, I think it's still the case that it's the worst part isn't actually in institutions, right? The worst part is at the border, prisons, on the streets, this kind of thing. So most people are thinking about how can we use cultural institutions that are still pretty safe and still have money to protect other people, to help other people, and to do that kind of thing, yeah.
I think it's important to read it for us today, the book, because it's not because it can be prophetic, but it can give us some tools for those who run the institutions, but also for those who work in the institution, how somehow to work today, and what to do, knowing that how looks the situation in the political field, but also knowing that in more and more countries in Europe, the situation becomes more difficult, complex. There is growing conservatism, but also that the system is a kind of a mimicry of itself. So there is a perpetuation in it. So sooner or later, things will happen in Poland that happened, for instance, in the States. And maybe we can also read for you before the book will come to Zamek and you can buy it, some of the solutions, because I think it's interesting to concentrate on that question, what to do for the future. So the one, and I want you, Dushko, to comment on them. So one comes from Regine Basha. And when she was asked the last question, how can art institutions be better, she answered, drop the race for biggest building, biggest collection, biggest opening, biggest spectacle, biggest ad, biggest font size. All the symptoms of ego-driven patriarchal systems that have a chokehold on us. Race instead toward being the most generous to artists and to the causes that affect an open society. More Bill and Melinda Gates, less Trumpism, please.
Yeah, that's good. I agree.
All right, let's go further. You told me that Chloe Bass is one of your favorite, yes, and idea of polyamory, which sounds very good. Tell me about that. What did she answer? And what she was talking about in the interview?
Yeah, so Chloe Bass is a social practice artist. I think she was the only I mean, we thought of her as a kind of curator in a sense because of her social practice projects, and that's why we asked her to respond to the questionnaire. And she responded in the form of a couples therapist. And so she, with every question that we had, she had a question, you know, kind of how a therapist does. And she would say, like, you know, if there's a question of the audience, like, how do you want to build that relationship? What kind of sacrifices do you want to make that relationship happen? How important is it to you? And I really like this response because it brought the question of institution and audience into kind of a funnier realm, you know, because I think, well, people, when they talk about an institution in the audience, they often do the thing like that Regine is speaking against, which is like, we have an audience, you know, 7,000 people came yesterday. That's an audience. We have 7,000, you know, so they have some number, and that number is the proof that they have this audience. Or, I don't know, I've seen Post-it notes at the end of the show or something, like write down your thoughts on a Post-it note. So this is kind of basic, silly idea of an audience. And I think the other thing that people can do is they kind of, institutionally, they kind of imagine an audience, I don't know, in some kind of fantasy way that they're serving this public, but it's a kind of fantasy, right? And I think what was really good with Chloe was that it brought it up as like a relationship, you know, like there are two, not people, but two bodies, let's say, that are like relating, and they're gonna have fights, and they're gonna have disagreements, but they can maybe have a long relationship if they respond to those kinds of things, you know? So I thought that was actually a very creative way to think about what an institution is and what a public is, and to talk about some of the difficult things that happen. For example, when you put up a show and the show angers your community, or people feel ignored or abused by some of the material. You know, if you have a healthy relationship, you can bring people in, talk about it, admit mistakes, promise some correction, agree to disagree. I don't know, all these things, again, that are a part of civil society can occur if you've decided to build a relationship. And a lot of institutions, I don't think they really are trying to build relationships, you know. Oftentimes they're just trying to make some money, or again, do the biggest show, or I don't know, you know, they have different goals that aren't like goals in that political sense, like not political in the sense of partisan, but just political in the sense of like dealing with groups of people, constituencies, and things that people care about. So that's why I like that one, yeah.
So one solution is downsizing. Then the other one proposed by also few voices in the book is to look, for instance, at the staff of the institutions, to look as individuals, to really focus on very particular voices, their individual character, to see people beyond the very general notions. But there are also speakers like Pablo Helguera, who are not necessarily agree that the institution should exist anymore in a way as it does. And he writes, for instance, sentence, it should be about the preservation of art in society. And that does not necessarily mean that we have to come up with solutions that keep the institution running. It means we have to come up with the solution that will help us reimagine what the role of art should be in every institution, not simply in art institutions. It's about the cultural shift of the role of art in every instance of life, not simply precluded or limited by the art institution, not in a lab where we preserve the experience. Art has to exist everywhere.
Yeah, so this is a really good observation. And for those of you that don't know Pablo Helguera, he works at MoMA, so it was a really funny answer for him to give. He runs the educational programs at MoMA, and he's also a very well-known social practice artist. And you know, he makes a really good observation, which is that you know, I think sometimes we're so focused on saving and fixing and preserving the institution that we don't realize that the institution might not be the thing that needs to stay, you know, like maybe the institution needs to go away and some new institution needs to happen, right? But of course, I mean, to take MoMA as an example, that's never going to be discussed at MoMA ever. They're only going to go bigger, 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 right? Also with downsizing, like being a little bit smaller, in a way, it's not that radical, right? Like we all want to lose weight maybe, or like, you know, you could like, say like at your house, you could say like, oh, maybe we should get rid of a few books or whatever. This is normal, right? But if you said something like that at a museum, at MoMA or something like that, everyone would have a heart attack because it would be like the worst thing, because the whole point is to keep getting bigger, stronger, you know, more real estate, larger, everything like that, and anything else is seen as failure. But we were talking about this earlier. I don't know, maybe a lot of smaller institutions is much better because they can change, they can adapt, they can disappear after 10 years. I don't know, you know? Maybe it wouldn't be a tragedy if some things disappeared. And there have been, I mean, there have been like modest things in this direction where, in the US, where people are deaccessioning works and then buying other works by underrepresented groups. Again, that's like seems to me like a very modest, basic thing. Like if you went shopping, right, and you had like too much cheese, you might be like, let's not buy any more cheese. You know, let's get some vegetables. But this is like very, very radical in a museum. And I think more of that kind of thing should happen. Like, I don't know. And rather than like centralizing power, maybe it would be better to have smaller institutions that could change. I don't know.
There are also a couple of voices that speak about precary work, and I was really positively surprised by Gina Bird, who said and who mentioned an initiative which I didn't know from before. It's WAGE certification. And so this is the company or NGOs that gives you a certificate that the organization, in fact, art institution in that case, is paying people fairly. And it's run by Lisa Soskolne. And she mentions that it's pretty easy to be certified. I'm quoting, not so being certified is an embarrassing indication that an organization is exploiting its workforce. And for me, it was really amazing idea when the art institutions can enter not only the ISO certificates, which we have in Poland, for many of us, it's a certificate that tells you that, you know, the production is running well, that you have processed your prints too, you learn how the structure should run, but also no one really takes care and speak loudly about the fair trade of the people, especially when we speak about finances and the payments, right? So WAGE is something to really look at and to think about. What do you think is the moment to open the floor for the public and ask questions from you or comments or yeah, there are already some hands.
Hi, I have one question. Because this, when you were telling about rich white men in the board, I was wondering why there is no rich people of color or LGBTQ who are like interested in funding the art. So that's one question. And the second one, I would like to comment about the crowdfunding, the culture, I don't know, festivals, institutions. Because we had this kind of wave in Poland as well. And it's very hard if you work in the culture institution and you fund from the money you earn the culture institution. And basically it's kind of circle when you need to find money to fund your own living because so I don't know if that's such a good idea. So that's a comment. It's
true, yeah. So to answer your first question, there certainly are wealthy people of color and LGBTQ people. Again, like I'm not an expert on who is on the boards of directors, but the way things are in the United States is that partly because of this variety of organizations, you do have organizations. For example, there's the Studio Museum in Harlem, which is committed to black art, and so I'm sure their board is entirely black. So that's good. They probably have an okay board, or at least they don't have those problems on their board. Same thing like in New York, there's the Leslie Lohman Center, which is committed to LGBTQ art. So I'm sure their whole board is gay. I would be shocked if it wasn't. You know, that would be impressive. So yeah, so it's not it's not like there's a 100% block. It's just that at the bigger institutions, what gets you on the board is giving money. I mean, that's how it works basically. Like, you give your money and you get on the board. So I mean, I think there are various ways to mitigate that. One, again, is taking money away from rich people, which I'm in favor of. In terms of crowdsourcing, I mean, yeah, I think you're right. It's a horrible thing, and in a way, it's a sign of more precarity if everyone's having to crowdsource all the time. It's a kind of nightmare. Like, you know, if I had to come up to you now and ask you each for, you know, one złote or whatever to fund me coming here, it would be a little bit awkward. But I guess I suggest it because I do think we need to think of something else. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think, it's interesting in a way because in Europe and in the US you have two very different systems. Like, Europe is very publicly funded, and we're seeing the problems with that, obviously, right? Which is if the government goes bad, then the funding goes bad. Okay, so that's a big problem. And in the US we have a different problem, which is that funding comes from wealth. So again, like, it's a problem. So without changing the entire political and economic system, it's hard to think of solutions. But I do think that in both cases, we don't like what's happening now, so we need to start trying other things, you know, like, and having other values, really, too. Like, that's a part of it. Like, I think, you know, Regina Basha brought up this good point of, like, the biggest, most expensive, whatever show. That's a very common value in the arts, is like the biggest, the most famous, the everything like this, that a lot of times doesn't depend on paying everyone who's working on the situation something good. It involves paying some people a huge amount of money. Famous artist gets a huge amount of money, director gets a huge amount of money, blah, blah, blah. And then other people don't get very much money at all. You know, it's everybody knows in culture generally, you don't get paid a lot of money. But the weird thing is there's so much money around, kind of hanging around. So I don't know. I think there are certain systems and certain communities that have a better relationship to how money works. I don't want to say like Paper Monument is like a great example or anything, but we very much decided that we wanted to have a small organization that got the money from the people who bought our books. Like, very simple. Like, we don't want a patron. We're not trying to get rich. We don't want to be rich. We just want to make things that are important to people, and then they give us some small amount of money. I forget, I think this book is $14, something like this. I don't know. $15. So, you know, it's like more modest, you know, and it's not trying, you know, this is maybe why Magda thought it was like innocent. It's not trying to be the biggest book or anything, you know. And so I don't know. I mean, there are music scenes, for example, I think that work pretty well. Like, people pay money, people live, it's okay. You know, I don't think it's impossible, you know, to like have culture without some people being very poor and other people being very rich. That just seems, you know, like a thing that we've added to culture, you know. So, but I'm not an economist.
Anyone else? No more questions? Oh.
I don't know if that is a question or a comment, but you already said it twice, and I think that is a very big problem. The structure we live in, and without changing that structure, I mean, we can only alleviate stuff, you know, make things a little bit better, but we can't change them. So I'm a pessimist in that department, I would say, because the big institutions are only going to get bigger. I mean, there's no way of, you know, scaling down in this respect. And so the exhibitions are going to get bigger. I mean, look at the biennial culture. there's more and more money involved, and even you know, initiatives that we liked, or I don't know who's we, but for example, I know the last Documenta, I liked it. It was great to be in Athens, and I think it was very well curated, but it was like pure excess in terms of scale and money involved and going over budget and, you know, all these things involved, you know. So while on the purely experiential level, it was great, on a whole lot of other levels, it was totally crazy, you know, thinking about how it is embedded in all other kinds of structures and, you know, processes. So, and maybe the question is, how do you understand this moment, the relationship of this moment to Occupy museums? Because this is something that started in 2011, no? And, you know, it's been going on for a long time, and their stance was like, without changing the structure, nothing will happen. And in a way, they're right, no?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. I just think it's like for me, it's a question of like, when you say structure, I mean, I think it's the whole, it's the political and economic structure that's the real structure. And, you know, I mean, I guess I'm in favor of attacking museums because they should be able to handle it. But I also don't think, you know, if we were able to like sort of chop up museums or a few of these things that I've suggested, you're right, it wouldn't change the overall picture at all. You know, and in that way, I think art needs to be more modest and humble about what its positioning is, you know. I think we can make certain contributions on a symbolic level and signal that, you know, as like whatever we are, culture people or something, we are in favor of these other things. We don't want any more of this. You know, we're supposed to be quite sensitive. We sense the obvious thing that the planet is, you know, in big trouble. We sense the obvious thing that, you know, there are all these violent, super violent structures going on, and we make the modest suggestion that we need to move in a different direction, you know? I don't think I'm not necessarily optimistic about that. I think we're very, we have a lot of very deep problems, you know? It seems to me, so, but I also think, you know, if, you know, even if we fail, we should probably try to move in the right direction anyways, try to have a good time while it's going on, you know, all this kind of stuff. Yeah, I mean, so I think I agree with what you're saying, but yeah.
I mean, one other thing, regarding the structure, you know, this is something you mentioned, that maybe, you know, the curatorial stuff should be more diverse, you know, and stuff like that. But so I'm just going to go back to an old Walter Ben Michaels argument, you know, where he says that identity politics is just like, especially in the States, it's just like as a screen that doesn't allow us to see the basic conflict that is there, which is a class conflict.
Yeah, I disagree with that because class and identity have always been connected, et cetera, et cetera. I don't want to have the like, I think they're always overlapping and intersecting. So it's true. I mean, changing the staff doesn't change the entire thing, but it's also true that that is one of the most effective ways to address the class problem in the U.S. Is to address the race problem. But it doesn't.
Well, you still have the board, which is, you know,
sure,
in big museums, all the board members are the 1%, which tend to be white, tend to be male.
Of course, and of course, and I think that, yeah, I mean, I don't want to get into a whole thing about different kinds of identity politics and stuff like that, but you're right, there's certainly like a kind of neoliberal identity politics, which is like, you move things around in the front and nothing changes. But I also think that, at least from my experience, changing who's involved in decisions changes the decisions, you know, like generally. I think, even if you look at it at like a domestic level, you know, if who's involved in the decision changes the outcome. So I think that's definitely maybe a modest thing, but a thing that can be done. And I think one of the, again, speaking from the American thing, which is a more multicultural context, for me, one of the number one signals of how important that is how difficult it has been for people to do and how much they resist it, because it actually is quite difficult to make decisions with people who have entirely different backgrounds, class position, race position, sexual identity, and everything like that. It just is. I think almost everyone would prefer to make decisions with someone who's just like them, right? That would be easier for everyone.
It's easier.
Yeah. You know, where do you want to go for dinner? Well, I like spaghetti. I like spaghetti too. So we go for spaghetti every night. But I think, especially in a multicultural society, you have to do that, right? So it should be happening at every organization, not just, again, like Pablo says, it's not just about museums, it's about anything. You have an elementary school or the fire department, or everyone should be making decisions in that way. You're right, I mean, but it doesn't eradicate class. It's true, you know, I mean, so.
What about this old socialist idea of cooperatives? Do you know any good examples in the States of people trying to set up cooperatives that would work in the art field specifically?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, there have been interesting things. I know there's this artist, Caroline Woolard, who is really into these kinds of solutions, and I think that some of these things are really good, like people set up land trusts. And the thing that Dina did at the lab is actually sort of a version of that, which is like, you know, trying to buy things together and have them in common, you know.
Yes, but did she crowdsource or did she make a cooperative? Because
that's an interesting thing. Yeah, I don't know.
Because crowdsourcing is people giving money to an institution.
Exactly, and then they're
making a cooperative is making people co-owners of the thing.
Yeah, and I don't know. The rhetoric was certainly cooperative, but I think you're right. The structure was probably just crowdsourcing. But to go back to Caroline, I mean, they've been trying to do this in New York, and some of the kind of long-standing organizations, I think ABC No Rio, there are a few of these kind of long-standing organizations in New York have been set up in that way. Some of them started off as squats, some of them started off as like gifts or negotiations with the city. And they have been run as cooperatives, and I think they're good, but it also goes back to your other point, which is that, you know, if there are gigantic structural problems surrounding the cooperative, eventually that ruins the cooperative too. So, like, if you have like one little cool building on the Lower East Side that you bought, it's good, but if the rest of the real estate market moves to this insane point and everyone has to leave or is homeless, then it doesn't really matter that you have a nice avant-garde cultural center. You know, I mean, so this is our situation. You know, same thing with the lab. You know, I'm in favor of it. I think it's great that they bought that building, but it's also insane. Their context is insane. Like, San Francisco cannot continue that way. It's insane, you know, so yeah, it's I mean, good that they have experimental music while it's happening, but there's a bigger problem.
I mean, they have employees of Google and Apple living in trailers. So
yeah, I know.
It's a big
thing. $3 million for nothing. Yeah. Let's have a happy question.
No one else? But Krzysztof, I will be a bit more optimistic to answer a question if I can. There are a couple of individuals that manage to reshape a little bit, for instance, the Biennale. If we look at like Gabin Combo last Berlin Biennale, or the way how the current curatorial team is trying to set it up or inform, for instance, on the press conference, what they are planning to do. Or if we look at this year Bergen Assembly, curated by Iris Dressler, Hans Christ, how they treat the idea precary work, for instance, in the cultural field, or Couture Biennale in Mechelen by Natasha Petreshin. So there are people who try to work with the system, Europeans I mentioned, who try to downsize maybe the structure, don't answer for the so simple expectations given by local governments, municipal governments, or to see the Biennale as a tool for economy of the city. But there are just a couple of them, and at the end we can really say what many of the authors are said, that it's all based and it all relates to people, right? To those who are doing it, to those very particular individuals, to the name that is behind the attitude, right?
Yeah, and I'll speak to, did I turn this off? Sound? No. There. Oh, okay. Magda brought up WAGE, which stands for Working Artists in the Greater Economy. And WAGE kind of addresses a problem that doesn't exist in Europe, I don't think, because the situation in the US is so bad with artist payments that I'll tell the story and then you'll understand. So in the US, before WAGE, there was almost no expectation that you would get any honorarium or any money at all to do a thing at an arts institution. The idea was you pay for the thing, they show your art, and later you sell the art to someone and you eventually get your money back, right? So the idea was that they're giving you exposure, right? So you take all the risk as an artist financially, and in the great American tradition, you then maybe get the profit later. But of course, it's very, very difficult to be an artist like that, and it means that it favors, obviously, work that sells, you know, like this is, you can't do a performance and then sell it or whatever. So WAGE was a very, very intentionally modest attempt to change that expectation just a little bit and to set like baseline basic levels of like, it's all set to how big the organization is, but something basic like $200 or $500 or something to be in a show. And the idea isn't that that covers your cost. The idea is just that it makes a slight change in how people see the relationship, right? So I think, again, this goes back to the kind of modesty, political modesty or whatever, but I do think that the changes that we can make are more or less like what is cool and what is not cool. That's like what art on some level does. And with WAGE, the idea that Magda brought up was that eventually, if you're not on that list, you're not cool. You know, like because the cool institutions are at least paying someone $500 so they don't starve to be in a show or whatever, right? And the expectation slightly over, you know, WAGE has been going, I don't know, for 10 years or something, but, you know, now I don't remember. They don't have that many people signed up. I mean, it's sort of sad, but they are slowly changing over how American institutions run, and this idea that that it's just not cool to make the artist take a huge risk and then have them get the profit. So, you know, I think we all can make these changes about what we expect, what we think is cool, what we accept. You know, like the Whitney situation, it's weird to tell that story because in a way it's so basic and so pathetic that this idea, right, that like you're like shooting chemical gas at children and making money off of that, so I don't want to associate with you. That would be like a basic position that I think most of us in this room would take, right? Like none of us would be like, hey, you know, let's go get drinks or whatever, right? Or if that guy said, I'm gonna buy you dinner, you would say, you know what, no, I don't want your money. It's like so basic, but it's not even, it's only happening with 7 of the artists, you know, like everybody else is like, yes, thank you, I'll keep participating, I feel bad, I keep going. So I do think we need to make these like small changes and about what we accept and what we don't accept, because everyone sees what happens when we accept everything that's happening now. It's terrible. So, yeah. Thank you.